Welcome to this rapid-fire explainer. Today, we're going to capture the essentials of this book in 8 minutes or less in English. We are diving straight into the definitive source material to strip away the pop culture myths and reveal the true story of the Vikings. Their legends are literally everywhere in our culture, but the real Norse seafarers, their actual lives were infinitely more complex and, honestly, way more incredible than any fictional tale you see on a screen right now. Let's get right into who these people actually were and how they fundamentally altered the course of human history. Okay, let's just jump right in and tackle that towering myth we all know. You know the one, the classic stereotype Hollywood still loves to sell us today. The giant savage barbarian, right? Bursting from the icy Atlantic waves just to plunder and conquer. Picture them in thick woolen tunics, holding huge battle axes. They're universally remembered as these terrifying marauders storming up coastal beaches to raid unsuspecting monasteries. It's an absolutely enduring, terrifying image. But why exactly did the specific version of them stick around for over 1,000 years? Well, the short answer, because the terror they inspired was very, very real. And the people they attacked wrote it all down. Take the year 793 AD. Monks writing the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle captured this sheer apocalyptic shock firsthand. They meticulously recorded how heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne through brutal robbery and slaughter. You have to put yourself in their shoes. To a group of quiet, unassuming monks on this isolated little island, a sudden, hyper-violent raid coming straight out of the ocean didn't just feel like a military defeat. It literally felt like the end of the world. That visceral trauma got burned into the historical record. And, we have to remember, these weren't just faceless mobs blindly attacking. History gives us their actual names, and it shows a staggering escalation in ambition. We're talking about brilliant tactical minds like Ivar the Boneless and Guthrum. These guys took simple raiding and scaled it up into massive, coordinated invasions across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Then you've got ruthless exiles like Eric the Red, pushing civilization out to the frozen edges of Greenland. Or Ingvar the Far-Traveled, taking fleets all the way down to the Caspian Sea, and Rodulf Haraldsson terrorizing European rivers. Basically, these guys were highly organized military entrepreneurs. But all of this brings us to a massive historical blind spot, and really the central question of this whole explainer. Were these Norse seafarers really just defined by the edge of an axe, or was all that bloodshed actually just a byproduct of a highly sophisticated, rapidly expanding empire? Because honestly, when we peel back the layers of those old chronicles written by traumatized monks, and we look at the actual archaeological evidence, a completely different, incredibly advanced civilization comes to light.
Right. So when we actually dig into the dirt, a striking duality emerges. Literally right next to the remains of splintered battle shields, archaeologists routinely dig up delicate, beautifully carved hair combs. They find precision shears, they find thousands of silver coins minted all the way in the Islamic East. Discoveries at dense urban settlements like Jorvik, which is modern-day York, show us that their civilization was powered by a dual engine. Sure, vicious raids brought in that initial startup capital, if you will, but it was their vast, highly organized trade networks that kept them on top. They operated with the sword and the scale.
And the true technological marvel making all this possible? It wasn't forged iron. It was an absolute masterpiece of engineering. The oak longship. Long, sleek, flexible, these ships could literally crash through violent ocean swells, driven by men rowing perfectly in sync. But here's the absolute game changer. They had an incredibly shallow draft. That meant they could cross the open ocean and then seamlessly glide right up shallow inland rivers to catch heavily fortified cities completely off guard. With that massive woolen sail, this wasn't just a boat. It was the ultimate piece of medieval military and commercial technology that let them outmaneuver basically every other civilization on Earth. This tech unlocked an unparalleled global footprint, and frankly, it is mind-boggling for the era. The Vikings basically claimed the treacherous Atlantic Ocean as their own personal highway. They mastered Russia's tricky river systems to trade in the Middle East. They built thriving settlements in the frozen extremes of Greenland. Oh, and yeah, they reached the shores of North America centuries before Christopher Columbus even thought about setting sail. Just picture the sheer scale of that. An interconnected world where one cultural group is trading fine silk in Baghdad while simultaneously hammering together timber halls on the coast of Canada. Absolutely wild. Yet to really humanize this story, we've got to look back at the home front. The reality is the vast majority of Norsemen never even lifted a sword in their entire lives. For them, the greatest, most lethal enemy wasn't some Anglo-Saxon king. It was the brutal Scandinavian winter. They were mostly farmers, desperately trying to grow crops like barley in super rocky soil. They herded sheep, they fished, they spent their incredibly short summers carefully salting and drying meat just to make sure their families wouldn't starve when the winter snow has locked them in. They were master craftsmen and survivors, deeply, deeply tied to their local communities.
And this tight-knit communal survival bred a really fascinating paradox. A society famous for lawless, brutal raiding abroad? Yeah. They actually had one of the most complex, proto-democratic legal systems in medieval Europe back home. They settled disputes and tried criminals at community assemblies called the Thing, where free men actually had a voice. But, and it's a big but, the sophisticated legal framework existed right alongside a brutally strict honor culture. To a Viking, reputation was everything. If your honor was slighted, you fought to the death to protect your family's name. So you had perfectly legal democratic assemblies operating parallel to these devastating multi-generational family blood feuds.
Now, to really understand their actions, you have to understand their cosmos. Their deep spirituality was woven into every single aspect of that harsh daily life. They believed the universe was just teeming with gods, goddesses, and magical creatures. Crucially, though, their gods weren't distant, peaceful moral judges. No, they were tempestuous forces of nature and war, which, if you think about it, perfectly reflected the brutal, unpredictable world the Vikings actually lived in. Their mythology was the exact lens through which they processed survival, victory, and death. At the absolute center of this entire cosmic worldview stood Yggdrasil, this colossal, life-giving ash tree. Its roots and branches didn't just hold the universe together, they acted like a massive spiritual superhighway. They connected the human realm of Midgard, which, by the way, they believed was encircled by a giant world serpent, directly up to the gods in Asgard. And those same roots reached deep, deep down into kingdoms of giants, all the way to the very bottom, Niflheim, a terrifying, icy place of eternal darkness. Which actually brings us to a rather grand historical irony. The Vikings didn't write these intricate myths down in books. These stories were kept alive through an incredibly complex oral tradition of skaldic poetry, memorized and performed out loud in mead halls. It wasn't until the 13th century that Christian scholars, most notably an Icelander named Snorri Sturluson, took the time to actually record these pagan stories into written sagas. So, the only reason we know the vivid details of Thor and Odin today is because Christian monks and scholars actively worked to preserve the intricate rhymes of an older rival religion. Talk about a plot twist. And epic sagas, like the legendary story of Bert and Jarl, bring all these concepts of honor, law, and violence brilliantly to life. Honestly, think of this specific saga like a medieval mafia epic, or a really tense political thriller. It tells the story of two deeply bonded friends, Gunnar and Jarl. But when a super minor, petty disagreement erupts between their wives, the strict cultural demand for honor just escalates everything. It shows exactly how heavy that Viking owner was. One single slight spirals into decades of murder and arson, burning down entire communities and completely exposing the fragile social fabric of their world. But, as we know, all eras must inevitably end. As the centuries passed, Scandinavia just became more integrated into the broader political landscape of Europe. The spread of Christianity fundamentally shifted their worldview. Centralized kingdoms replaced the old fractured chieftainships, and that whole era of sudden, terrifying raids from the sea finally faded out. But here's the key takeaway. The Vikings weren't so much defeated as they were assimilated. They settled in places like Normandy, integrated with the locals, and eventually became the very European monarchs and heavily armored Christian knights they once used to raid. So they didn't just fade into the misty pages of history. They actively shaped the borders, the trade routes, and the cultures of the modern Western world. Next time you picture a Viking, ask yourself, are you just seeing a mindless barbarian from the movies, or are you looking at the ruthless, brilliant architect of a globalized world? If you enjoyed this, subscribe to N8 Minutes and never miss what matters.